In modern Australia, something genuinely rare still exists. Towns where teenagers are not permanently attached to their phones because mobile reception barely works at all. These are places where the pub remains the true heart of community life, not a polished gastro venue serving $32 Wagyu burgers to passing tourists. In these towns, the main street still looks the way it did when your grandparents were young. It is not preserved as a museum, not marketed as heritage for social media. It simply never changed because no one ever got around to changing it. These places still exist, they remain affordable, and they have quietly protected something most Australians believe has disappeared forever. As we count them down, one town in particular stands out. It once appeared on Australia's $10 note as the image of historic Australia, and remarkably, nearly 60 years later, it still looks exactly the same. At number 12 is Nhill in Victoria, with a population of around 2,100 people. It sits roughly 375 kilometers from Melbourne in the Wimmera wheat belt, where median house prices fall between $180,000 and $250,000. What makes Nhill special is how little has been altered. The town's Art Deco cinema, the Nhill Theatre, has been showing films on weekends since 1936 in the same building, with the same seating, manual ticketing, and even an interval where chalk tops are sold from a cart. This is not a staged recreation. It is simply how it has always been done. Victoria Street still displays original shop fronts from the 1920s through to the 1960s, complete with hand-painted signs, verandas extending over the footpaths, a family bakery using recipes from the 1950s, a butcher with handwritten price tags, and pubs serving counter meals at prices that would make Melbourne wince. There are no traffic lights. Wednesday afternoon closing still applies for some shops. The Country Women's Association remains influential, and the football club continues to operate as the town's real social center. A third-generation farmer in his late 60s, who has lived in Nhill for all of his 67 years, said his grandfather would still recognize the main street. The signs have faded and the cars have changed, but the bones remain exactly the same. The pub, the bank, and even the arguments at the football club. The trade-off is isolation, hot and dry summers, limited entertainment, and young people leaving for education and careers. Specialist services require long trips to Horsham or Melbourne. But for retirees seeking quiet, families wanting children raised in small-town Australia, or remote workers wanting real rural life, Nhill delivers. A working wheat town that never tried to become anything else and preserved itself purely by accident. At number 11 is Peterborough in South Australia, home to around 1,800 people, located about 250 kilometers or 3 hours from Adelaide. Median house prices range between $120,000 and $200,000, with some heritage railway cottages selling for even less. Peterborough was built by the railways, and when railways were the arteries of Australia, this town was a major junction. Much of that infrastructure still stands. Magnificent stone railway buildings, a fully operational roundhouse and turntable, and steam locomotives maintained by volunteers who remember when this was how the country moved. The main street features solid colonial buildings from the 1880s through to the 1950s, Art Deco shop fronts with original tiling, bakeries still using old ovens, and hardware stores selling stock that genuinely has not moved since the 1970s. Everything closes on Sundays, the town empties at lunch, and there are no traffic lights. A former railway worker in his early 70s who arrived in 1971 explained that when the railways left, everyone expected Peterborough to die. Instead, it simply went quiet and stayed exactly as it was. The buildings remain, the pubs still operate, and the roundhouse still works, only at a slower pace now. The trade-off is population decline, limited employment, and a lingering sadness in a town that has passed its peak. But for retirees, heritage lovers, railway enthusiasts, or people who appreciate what they have, Peterborough offers a railway town frozen in time, preserved in stone and steam. At number 10 is Chiltern in Victoria, with about 1,200 residents. It lies 275 kilometers from Melbourne and just 30 kilometers from Wangaratta. Median house prices range between $380,000 and $500,000, driven upward by proximity to Beechworth. Chiltern's main street is a virtually intact gold rush streetscape that was never restored or reconstructed. It simply never changed. A pharmacy still operates in its original 1860s building with vintage fittings, selling modern aspirin. The Athenaeum Hall has been functioning since 1866, and the Star Hotel still retains its 1860 structure. Verandas cast sharp shadows on the footpaths, faded painted signs line the street, and even wooden hitching posts remain visible. The general store has wooden floors and pressed-in ceilings. There are no traffic lights, and shop hours depend largely on when someone feels like opening. A woman in her early 60s who retired from Melbourne 8 years ago said she walked down the main street and felt as though she had time traveled, not to a museum, but to a real place that simply kept going. She bought a house 6 months later. The trade-off is rising prices, limited services, and little local employment. But for heritage lovers, remote workers, or anyone seeking character without extreme isolation, Chiltern remains a gold rush town that somehow stayed normal while everywhere else modernized. At number 9 is Junee in New South Wales, home to about 4,500 people, 450 kilometers from Sydney and just 40 kilometers from Wagga Wagga. Median house prices sit between $280,000 and $380,000. Junee was once a major railway town, and its architecture still reflects that former importance, with Art Deco and Victorian facades throughout. The Junee Railway Roundhouse is one of only 2 operational roundhouses in New South Wales, where volunteers run historic locomotives using original 1940s infrastructure. The wide main street is lined with grand buildings. Bakeries continue to operate, old-style pubs retain original fittings, and hardware stores have barely changed in decades. A couple in their late 50s who moved from Sydney 6 years ago said they passed through Junee once and realized they had found something everyone else had forgotten. Houses selling for $250,000 that would cost $1.5 million in any coastal town. They retired 10 years early as a result. The trade-off is distance from Sydney, hot summers, limited employment, and reliance on Wagga Wagga for many services. But for retirees, families, and commuters, Junee delivers a grand railway town preserved through benign neglect. At number 8 is Burra in South Australia, with around 1,100 residents, 2 hours or 160 kilometers from Adelaide. Median house prices range from $220,000 to $350,000 for heritage cottages. Burra was once Australia's largest inland town during the mining boom of the 1850s, and astonishingly, it remains largely intact. The entire streetscape is stone, with buildings that appear carved from the earth. Over 1,800 people once lived in dugouts carved into Burra Creek, which still exists today. Wide streets, verandas, silence broken only by wind and crows. It feels like stepping into the 19th century. A retired teacher in his late 60s who moved from Adelaide 12 years ago said most tourists go to the Clare Valley and miss Burra entirely, which suits the residents just fine. He lives in a stone cottage that costs less than a suburban Adelaide unit. The trade-off is minimal services, no nearby hospital, extreme temperatures, and almost no employment. But for history lovers, retirees, artists, and writers, Burra offers solitude and heritage that in any other country would be a UNESCO site. At number 7 is Ross in Tasmania, with just 350 residents. Located on the Midland Highway between Hobart and Launceston, Ross has median house prices between $400,000 and $600,000. Its crown jewel is the Ross Bridge, carved between 1831 and 1836 by convict stonemason Daniel Herbert, featuring 186 intricate carvings. 200,000 cars a year pass within meters of it without stopping, and that indifference preserved the town. Ross remains a complete Georgian and Victorian village, with honey-colored sandstone buildings, tree-lined streets, and one of Australia's oldest continually licensed pubs, operating since 1835. An artist in her early 50s who moved from Melbourne 10 years ago said the town's authenticity, silence, and light never change because no one pressures it to. The trade-off is limited services, cold winters, island isolation, and higher prices, but for those wanting to live inside history rather than just visit it, Ross delivers. At number 6 is Sofala in New South Wales, population around 200, about 250 kilometers from Sydney and 45 kilometers from Bathurst. This is Australia's oldest surviving gold town, with a timber main street that looks like a Western movie set because it actually is real. The Royal Hotel has operated continuously since the gold rush. There is no ATM, no petrol station, and patchy phone reception. You hear the Torrent River, wind through eucalyptus, and the occasional generator. A retired couple in their 70s who moved there 15 years ago still pan for gold for fun. They accept the lack of services, the tiny property market, and the risk of medical emergencies because nothing else offers this level of authenticity. Ravenswood in Queensland follows, with a population of around 290 kilometers from Townsville. At its peak in 1903, 4,500 people lived there. Today, only 200 remain, yet over 2,000 graves fill the cemetery. Two Victorian-era pubs still operate, serving a town that has lost 95% of its population but refuses to disappear. The publican at the Imperial Hotel said he pours beers where miners once stood in 1890. The trade-off is extreme isolation, brutal heat, and no services, but what remains is one of the most authentic gold rush towns in the country. Then comes Kew in Western Australia, population about 650 kilometers from Perth. Built for 10,000 people, Kew now feels like a miniature city stranded in the desert. Grand Victorian buildings dwarf the population, and the Queen of the Murchison Hotel still operates in its original form. A third-generation resident in his late 60s said his grandmother remembered 10,000 people, his generation remembered 500, and now there are 200. Medical care depends on the Royal Flying Doctor Service. Summers are brutal, and the future is uncertain, but the history remains in every stone. At number 3 is Malden in Victoria, population around 1,500, just 135 kilometers from Melbourne. In 1966, Australia declared Malden its first notable town because nothing had changed. 58 years later, that is still true. Every building on the main street dates from the Gold Rush era. No chain stores exist, no modern signage interrupts the streetscape, and heritage steam trains still run. A longtime Historical Society member said the town looks this way because residents repeatedly said no to modernization. The trade-off is high prices, tourism crowds, and strict heritage rules, but Malden remains a town preserved not by accident, but by choice. At number 2 is Silverton in New South Wales, population about 50. Once home to 3,000 people, Silverton is now one of Australia's most photographed towns and has appeared in countless films, including Mad Max and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. The red dirt, blue skies, and frontier buildings form a natural movie set. An artist who moved there in 1994 bought a miner's cottage for $8,000 and has painted the landscape ever since. The trade-off is extreme heat, total isolation, and reliance on Broken Hill for everything. But for those who want to live inside the outback, Silverton delivers. At number 1 is Goolgong in New South Wales, with a population of around 2,500, just 30 kilometers from Mudgee. In 1966, the Reserve Bank chose Goolgong for the $10 note because it looked like historic Australia. Today, it still does. The main street remains a continuous gold rush streetscape from the 1870s. The Prince of Wales Opera House has been operating since 1871. Shops close early, Wednesday afternoons still see closures, and the town empties after 6 p.m. except for the pubs. A retired couple who moved from Sydney 12 years ago said they took a wrong turn and ended up in Goolgong. The wife cried because it looked exactly like the town her grandmother described. They bought a house that afternoon. Unlike other towns, Goolgong combines heritage with functioning services, a hospital, schools, and shops, while remaining affordable and authentic. These 12 towns prove that the pace of life people believe vanished in the 1960s never truly disappeared. It simply moved to places most people stopped looking. But this lifestyle comes with trade-offs: limited services, weak internet, distance from cities, and fewer conveniences. Those challenges are exactly what preserve these places. This way of life suits retirees seeking real community, families wanting children to know old Australia, and remote workers wanting escape without total isolation. It does not suit those who need constant entertainment, fast careers, or specialist medical care. The Australia your grandparents described, where the butcher knew your name and the pub was the center of town, is still out there. These towns are proof.